keyboards, comics, and taking control of your Apple account with Glenn Fleishman. This is MacVoices. Today's MacVoices is supported by MacVoices After Dark. What happens before the show starts and after we sign off? Informative, fun, and completely off-script conversations. That's what. MacVoices After Dark is an exclusive benefit for our Patreon subscribers. Sign up now at patreon.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, one of the busiest authors I know is Glenn Fleishman. I can't keep up with his books. Sometimes he can't even keep up with which books he's published. We're going to try to touch on a number of them just briefly because there are so many things, so many interesting things that he's doing, and also so many things that you should know about. Glenn, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's so nice to see you. I'm so glad to be able to talk to you again.
Well, I really appreciate you letting me get on your calendar because there are different things that I wanted to talk to you about. I see projects go by on Mastodon and think, okay, I need to learn more about that next time I talk to Glenn. So I've got a whole list of things, but also we want to talk about what you want to talk about.
Well, my life has shifted around as I used to spend most of my time doing freelance journalism and a lot of how-to journalism. So it's like some reporting and the Take Control books and Macworld, Mac 911. And now I do kind of a big chunk of my time is doing technology stuff, but it's not technology related. So like I worked on this book with a client last year about the history of keyboards. And then I did a book on the history of comic printing this year. So I'm still doing technology, but it's kind of Take Control is like in Mac 911 are my big focuses in the Mac and how-to world.
Well, let's start with the keyboard and comic printing books, because I think that's very interesting. You've always been known as having an interest in the history of technology and sort of how we got to where we are. And I think it's valuable because we don't always appreciate just how far we've come and the sophistication that has occurred with some of the devices and things that we just see as commonplace now.
Yeah, it's. I was lucky enough to work for several years with an author, Marcin Wishari, who did this great book called Shift Happens, which is sold out. You can only get copies secondhand on eBay. Unfortunately, he's not clear if he wants to do another edition of it because he sunk so much of his life getting the first one out and sold thousands of copies, and it was this massive undertaking in 2023, and then finishing the last shipping in 2024. And it was a book about the history of keyboards from like the earliest, like literally the first keyboard was a single key, or the first typewriter keyboard was a single key. The guy Scholes, who developed Christopher Scholes, who developed the first there's like all these footnotes. Well, there was a guy in Denmark who developed the type ball, and there are all these other efforts, but the typewriter that went into production that became the Remington, I think #1, that typewriter came from this one guy who was completely obsessed and had different partners at different times. And some of them were angry at him later because they'd been cut out or they'd bought his stock out, whatever. But it literally started with one key. He took a telegraph key and turned it into a thing that could tap and put ink on paper. And from that, this whole revolution started. So the book kind of starts with these typewriter precursors and early stuff, and then goes into the whole history of the typewriter, then into the teletype and that transitionary period, computer typesetting, word processing, and into modern like glass keyboards, but also the whole resurgence of mechanical keyboards. So it's beautifully illustrated. Like I say, it's kind of a sad thing. You have to go to a library to look at it if you didn't get a copy, because again, I went out to a printer in Maine with him in summer of 2023, and we were on press supervising the printing for 100 hours, like 8 days of like 2 shifts a day. The workers would come and go, and we'd be there the whole time as they changed shifts. But it was it was a 1,300 page, 3-volume work in a slipcase. The whole thing, everything about it was huge. But it was a lot of fun to look back at, and to see all the ideas that people had come up with earlier in technology history, but either they didn't catch on or the technology wasn't ripe enough at the time. So you look at, the great one is Jeff Raskin had all these ideas, and he's got very nice mentions in the book. I know he passed away, 20 years ago now, 15 years ago. And he was an irascible guy, always had to say something negative to people, always fighting for credit for his work, but also incredibly generous and funny and talented, and the underpinnings of much of the modern technology world, the way that we interact with technology, owes something to Jeff Raskin, and a chunk of that centers around his thinking about keyboards and input design. So anyway, it's just fun to see these ideas that were percolating for a long time actually pop up into like production stuff that we use every day today.
Yeah, and again, I'm not necessarily a huge history buff, but I'm getting more and more of an appreciation for learning how we got here and why maybe something, it's in my humble way, I look at something and say, well, this doesn't make any sense at all. But there's a reason that it got that way. Mm-hmm. And, then you start to appreciate that and understand it, and you're much more accepting of it.
Well, the whole QWERTY keyboard versus Dvorak keyboard debate that's been raging for decades, where some people like have you ever used the Dvorak keyboard? I've occasionally messed around with it.
Yeah, I tried, and it just, unfortunately, I learned QWERTY, and so.
Yeah, it makes your head. So there was this assertion for a long time that Dvorak was better. It was better on your fingers, produced less strain. You could type faster. Doesn't really play out in fact. And the QWERTY keyboard, it was developed. People wonder why the keys were in the arrangements they were. There's these myths about you can type the word typewriter entirely on the top row, which is fascinating. And what it turns out, what my author client found, and he didn't pioneer this research, but he, I think, presented it in a comprehensive way that hasn't been presented before, is that this inventor of the keyboard, he was obsessive about testing things out, and a certain point in one of the prototypes for the keyboard, for the typewriter rather, he had arranged the type bars in such a way that QWERTY layout was the optimum way to avoid bars crossing. And then everything changed. The type bars weren't like that later. So we're using a keyboard design from maybe the 1870s that was optimized for that. It has nothing to do with any later keyboard or type bar arrangement or anything. Nothing at all. It's entirely to do with one model created 150 years ago. And that's why we use it. And then Dvorak was like the modern advantage, modern improvement. It's rational and this and that, less key movement. We should all be adopting it. And then it turns out, again, it doesn't offer the benefits promised, although it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly equivalent. It's just you're stuck with what you learn is kind of the big issue. And some of the fastest typists ever have used QWERTY. Some of the fastest typists ever have used Dvorak. And the real question is, what I heard, 30 years ago, everyone was talking about Dvorak because it was easier to change your keyboard layout suddenly. You didn't need a special keyboard. You could hit a button right in your Mac or on a PC and put an overlay on your keyboard, or just, touch type it. And I tried it for a bit, and it made my head, I'd get headaches from doing it. And I thought, if this doesn't work for me, I'm in an intermediate territory where I don't know where any key is. I need to stop now before I ruin my typing ability.
Yep. I'm right there with you. Because I tried it, and it's funny, I never even thought of it as, but that's exactly the feeling I had, trying to shift my brain into which keyboard layout am I using, and sort of take then a second step. Okay, where's the A? And it's slowed you down. And I guess some people, like they learning multiple languages, they just have that gene that it clicks for them and makes sense. But I don't know how people learn, 8, 10, 12 languages. That's insane.
I don't know. I was just setting type by hand for the other day, which is not something I do commonly, even though you might think from my history that I do. But I was setting type for this project that's part of this comics history book. It's one of the special reward tiers that I'd offered, and working with this letterpress printer I know. And I learned, they call it the way that letters are laid out in a type case, which is like a drawer of type. It's called the lay of the case. And the E has a really big area because you use E's a lot, and the T is fairly big. And you can trace it out with Eta Owen Shirtlew, ETAOINSHRDLU. Those are the top 12 letters by frequency in order in the English language. And different languages have different frequencies, of course. So the lay of the case, I learned it years ago, and I hadn't touched the type case for years. And my brain is like, where's the E? Where's the R? And then I wasn't setting a lot of type, but by the time I got a few lines in, I'm almost remembering to which thing to pluck a key with. It's like typing, but it's typing by pulling letters out with your fingers.
Well, talk a little bit. Use that as a segue to the comic. I want to say not the comics book, but the book about
I know
comics.
I keep saying comics book.
Yeah, let's make sure we understand that.
Yeah.
What was the genesis for this?
Oh, well, I was doing a design residency back in 2017, which I'm sure at different appearances I've mentioned different parts of that project. And I wound up going to London and doing some research and printing a book of work I'd written about type and language and just a lot of different things that year. And but in my research, I started coming across references to this intermediate thing called flong, Flong, that was used in metal printing as a mold. So you'd take your metal type that was flat, you'd have laid it all out with sometimes with images, and printers would put this sheet of like a cardboard like substance under pressure on top of it, peel it off, and suddenly it's a mold. Then they could put it in a semi-cylindrical casting unit, pour lead in, and you would get a rounded plate that could go on a circular press, like the old newspaper presses you see. And whenever they show, a stock photo, it's always this press going, hung, 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 hung. You see paper running through it a million. So you need plates that are curved, but when you're doing type in metal, it's all flat. So this was a medium to essentially convert flat type in tiny pieces into a curved plate that could be printed really fast. So I'm like, oh, I don't know about this. And the more I dug into it, the more I found that there were lots of pieces of comic art that, especially comic strips, that had survived the metal printing era that were in metal, like plates, flat plates, and this flong, this paper-like substance. And I started to collect it out of curiosity, started to do some research, and it's 6 years later, and I had dived really deeply during the pandemic into more research because we were all bored, as you remember. We were all working home. So I'd done a lot more reading. I started talking to people, and I thought, I think there's a book here if I can get the rights and find the materials. And I found a wonderful institution called the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum that's part of the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And they are the greatest collection in the United States by far of comic strip art, of comic book art, and books about comics. And they also have a reasonable amount of printing materials, like artifacts used in printing and original drawings. They are the Bill Watterson Depository Collection is part of their outfit. So they have all of Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes originals are there. He donated them all, and they're available for researchers. They have entire studios of cartoonists like Milt Caniff, who did Terry and the Pirates, and Steve Canyon. It's an incredible place. And one thing they have is the Bill Blackbeard collection, which is 2.5 million newspaper clippings of comics. The guy drove around the country with buddies, and they would save all these deaccessioned comics of newspaper volumes coming out of libraries, as libraries got rid of their huge, they're trying to downsize, they're switching to microfilm. He collected all this, pulled out pages or strips, because he said, if I don't do this, it's all going to be lost. He was entirely right. And so he's called the man who saved comics because of that. So I had access to all this incredible material, these wonderful librarians and curators and researchers who are not deep on the printing side. They were very interested in somebody who could come in and figure this out for them, because it wasn't really part of their academic expertise as comics historians, was not like the history of printing. And so they're very encouraging. So fast forward to 2024, I launched a project in February of this year and raised almost $170,000 for a book I called How Comics Were Made, which is about the process from an artist's hand through all these intermediate printing steps to getting to the newsprint page and then to the web page now. And it's, here, I'll show you. And the book was just printed about 2 weeks ago. And so out of the oven to my Julia Child, here's the book. And so it's, it's basically era after era. I don't know if I can flip it and show it from the video side here, but it's era after era from, all the way back, literally starting a little bit with Gutenberg through all these production processes and pieces. And I got permission from Gary Trudeau to reproduce some strips that had never run before, but existed in printing artifact form. Bill Watterson. Oh, that's funny. You have a green screen, so the disappearing. But there's a lot of green on this page. Bill Watterson gave me permission to reproduce Calvin and Hobbes and gave me some interview quotes I could use. There's some Peanuts. There's a whole chapter on Peanuts production. So it was a real hoot, and everyone's been incredibly generous with the materials. But it's kind of a history of printing, but it's told through the lens of the cartoonist and the production people that made it possible. And anyway, I'm very excited about it. It's been incredibly fun to do, and it's about to ship. Like as we speak, I think some copies might be going out today. The first copies. Breaking news.
Well, that's good. Now, before I forget to ask about that
Oh,
one, where do you get it?
It's still, I have some copies left at howcomicsweremade.inc, I-N-K, or for short, hwcm.inc. We'll take you there. I don't know. I thought ink would be funny. It's usually for tattoo artists, but yeah. I thought it applied for comics.
I did not know that either. Now there's another one.
There's so many there's like 50,000 top level domains now. So I was like, .inc, that sounds great.
Yeah. But the tattoo artists have gravitated toward that. I did not know that.
I don't know, but it's not that expensive as, you know, because you want to find, it's hard to get, particularly, this is a little bit of an obscure thing that I know listeners will appreciate is there's that issue of how do you type in a URL in a book? You don't want to give somebody a 100 character URL, and some of the stuff that I'm referring to in my book, I've got it's 150 endnotes. I didn't put footnotes in; they're all at the end, so people who want them, they can find the number, but it doesn't mix in with the copy. And it'll be like a page on a Google Books, link, and you can shorten them, but those are weird. So I don't want someone to sit there and be like typing it in, and if they don't have the ebook in front of them, if they haven't bought the ebook, they can't click it. So I created a link shortener, very simple technology. There's a tiny database behind it, and it's hwcm.ink, howcomicsweremade.inc, basically. And so in the book, you type in hwcm.ink / and then there's like a 3-letter code, and that will get you to this longer URL. So that was my workaround. There's not that many domains registered in .inc, so you can get a 4-letter domain, and it's just as expensive as a 15 or 20-letter domain. That's a hack for you all. If you just find a weird TLD, if you want a short domain for some project you're working on.
Wow. Well, let's shift over to the Take Control books, because there are a few of those we want to talk about.
Gosh.
I know I just wanted to touch on your book, Take Control of Your Apple Account, because as we record this only a day or two ago, we got news that now Apple will allow you to change your iCloud account. And this has been something that just was not possible. And to be clear, I'll stop us right here and say, no, this is not merging if your iCloud account and your your App Store account, but your actual change your iCloud account, which you could not do before.
I wonder if it's a stepping stone towards merging, because it's the first change we've seen in Apple account structure for years. Because there was one thing you could do, and I've documented this in the book for years, is if you had a non-Apple address, not at iCloud.com, at Mac.com, or at me.com, you could change your Apple ID to another non-Apple address. But once you changed it to an iCloud related address, you could never change it again to anything. You couldn't change it to a non-Apple address or to another one. So you kind of had this one-way path. So some of us, and you're probably one of them, because we started so long ago, like I have my email address is one of my Apple IDs, and an iCloud address is another, it's the iCloud is my purchase address, because we started with iTunes Store. iTunes Music Store is my personal email address, and my other account. So I don't know. I'm hoping maybe this means they've poked at the database a little bit. Maybe they'll let us do it. But so I had it. So as everyone listening and watching knows, is Apple ID became Apple account in September 2024. And I had a book inconveniently named Take Control of Your Apple ID. So the book was revised, and the biggest change in the book was really that. And there are a lot of little tweaky things. Apple's made some things better. They moved settings around. Hide my email is better. Finally, at last, it's a little more rationalized. But this, of course, is an 18. Being able to change your iCloud address is an 18.1 iOS, iPadOS 18.1, or the documentation we've seen so far, all the early stories are 18 or iOS 18.1. I'm hoping it's also coming to Sequoia 15.1 when that's out. And I believe people believe that it's like October 26th, I think, is the expected, or 27th is the date that Apple's going to ship it. No, I got that wrong. 28th? A week from
like that, yeah.
Soon, before Halloween.
Yeah. So, and this interview may or not be published before then, but if it's before, great, it's coming shortly. And if it's not, then it just happened. So
happy Halloween and or Thanksgiving, everybody. So, but so the feature is just going to let you actually change the address, which is fantastic. And what we were talking before recording, that people, if you get a divorce, if you change your name, all these things, you could be stuck with an old moniker. It's the most frequent question I get to Macworld's Mac 911 email address is, I should say it used to be, I think Apple has improved Apple accounts a little bit because it's tapered off. For years, my most frequent questions were, how do I merge two accounts? How do I split two accounts? How do I change the address? How do I add an alias, which a lot of people don't know you can add up to 3 aliases that are just unique iCloud.com addresses to your Apple account. And you can set different rules at iCloud.com. So they're actually processed in different ways. You can forward them to different addresses, do other things with them. So this is actually, I would say, is like a major change that will address some percentage of people's issues with Apple ID login account names. So I welcome it. I think a lot of people will welcome it.
Yeah, I would hope against hope the idea of being able to consolidate the two. But I've heard from people that have talked to Apple engineers that say, the way the databases were built, they were just never intended to do that. I mean, there seem to be a lot of reasons they can't do it, not won't do it, can't do it, because they would love to, just to simplify things.
Yeah. I just assume it would cost them so much money and the transition would be so ugly that there's nobody inside the company who, I've said this many times, they need to find somebody who's 2 years away from retirement, or maybe 3, who's willing to take on a job that would destroy their career at the company if they were going to be there any longer if it went south, because they'd be like, all right, Bob, you're going to retire in 3 years. This is your baby and you got to see it through before you go. And Bob or Jill or somebody will make it happen. You keep coming across weird things with this, though, where there's so many licensing issues. Joe Kissel and I are trying to test SharePlay the other day, and editor-in-chief of the Take Control, editor and publisher of Take Control Books. And Joe is in Canada. I'm in the United States. And I click a SharePlay thing in FaceTime, and he said, I just got an error that said you can't stream this content in Canada. It's like, I literally can stream this content in Canada. It was the Happy Halloween Charlie Brown, or whatever that's called, Charlie Brown Halloween special. It's licensed in both countries. He can play it. I can play it. We can't use SharePlay because the licensing or the SharePlay system will not let you share over licensing domains, even if the license is the same, even if everyone has the same rights. So I'm assuming some of the Apple account stuff has to do with the complexity of managing of how they record licenses for your purchases. And if you merged accounts, I wonder if that is like a whole ball of wax because you have different permissions. I don't know, but I fear it is intractable.
Well, and to think about the issues surrounding the purchase of software with the apps for your in your apps that
my God,
you've bought this, so it's under this ID, but I can't shift it to that ID, or I want to, and I mean, think about the customer service nightmare that this would potentially cause if it did.
The poor developers. Yeah, the in-app purchases, if you couldn't move those over, and then it would be the developers would be blamed. There'd be millions of people yelling at developers, and they'd be like, Apple broke the receipt system or whatever. So yeah, there's not a lot of motivation to fix something that's not totally broken, even if it's not great. It's probably just going to linger indefinitely, is my guess.
Yeah, it feels like there are a lot of downsides to actually, I hadn't thought about all those downsides until we started talking about it, and it's like, maybe it's best if you just leave it alone. I
know sometimes you're like, let's not touch the thing that's sort of so fragile that it might break if we look at it too hard.
Exactly. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices, or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you Mac Voices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com, Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.